The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so for now. For it is the proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." The Gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Speak to in the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. The season of Epiphany always begins the same way. The season of Epiphany actually starts on January 6th every year with the date of the Epiphany. Epiphany ends the 12 days of Christmas, the official Christmas season. And Epiphany is always on January 6th. It's the day we set aside and remember that the Magi, the wise men, traveled to Jesus and gave them gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, it took the wise men quite a while to get to Jesus. We often envision this all happening in the stable a few days after Jesus' birth, but about 2 years passed. Took the wise men a little bit of time to figure out where the star was going. So about 2 years have passed, and they finally greet a toddler Jesus with these gifts. And then the season of Epiphany begins after January 6th. And the season of Epiphany is the season in which we remember that God is made manifest in Jesus, and the church is invited to have an epiphany every year. And the season of Epiphany always begins the exact same way. After the Magi have arrived, the first Sunday after the Epiphany, we have the same gospel reading. We have the baptism of Jesus. We get it from different versions of the Bible, but this year we're in Matthew, and so we hear Matthew's version of Jesus' baptism. And the baptism of Jesus always begins Jesus' formal ministry. It's the first thing that Jesus does. So from the time Jesus is 2 and the wise men visit him to the time Jesus is 30 and re-enters the public scene, a lot has happened. But we come into Jesus at 30 when he decides to be baptized. It's the first official public act that Jesus does. And it officially begins his ministry. And Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan, and he's baptized by John the Baptizer. And he comes to this place to be baptized. And there's a lot of conversation around why Jesus was baptized. But essentially, in Jesus' time, baptism was a ritualistic cleansing. You wanted to be clean before you would go into the temple and greet God. And so you would be baptized. In a way, you would be ritualistically cleansed. You would clean yourself before you would come into the temple. And so Jesus goes to the river to be baptized, which is somewhat unique because you could certainly do this outside the temple with, maybe cleaner water than you would find in the Jordan River and by actual priests who watched the temple. But Jesus goes to where the people are. And John the Baptist, as we learned about in Advent, is a unique character because he's kind of wild. He eats wild honey and locusts, and he has a belt tied around his waist, and he greets people with insults of "you brood of vipers." And yet people flock to him. People have come to be baptized to him. And maybe some people come to the river to see John because they want to see this spectacle of John. They want to see this somewhat wild man spewing insults, and they want to see what has happened. But maybe other people come to John because they don't feel like they belong in the temple. Maybe they don't feel holy enough, even with this ritualistic cleansing, to enter the temple. So they go outside, and they go to a place where someone will baptize them. And then Jesus comes and he's baptized alongside them. And Jesus' first official act of ministry is baptism, but the other underlying part of the first official part of Jesus' ministry is a coming alongside the people that he will serve. He goes to where they are. He's baptized by the person that baptizes them. He enters the water as they enter the water. And he hangs out with the people who maybe don't feel welcome in the temple. In the Episcopal Church, we have long held that baptism, because Jesus did it, and it was the official start of Jesus' ministry, is an incredibly important sacrament. And sacraments in the Episcopal Church are defined as outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. That's from the Book of Common Prayer in your catechism. You can turn to the back end of it, and you can find that definition. So sacraments are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. And in the Episcopal Church, we have 2 sacraments, baptism and communion, and we have 5 sacramental rites, rites spelled R-I-T-E, meaning liturgies. And the 5 sacramental rites are confirmation, reconciliation of a penitent, meaning confession, holy matrimony, unction of the sick, and holy orders to either the diaconate priesthood or to become a bishop. So we have these different ways in which sacraments are done. And I want to spend a little bit of time about talking about the way sacraments have really changed in COVID. And I want to bring us back to March of 2020. In March of 2020, every church seemingly went online, and most of the way in which sacraments were done was suspended. Communion was not done, baptism was not done, people were not getting married, clergy weren't allowed inside hospitals, confirmation wasn't happening, bishops weren't visiting, holy orders was suspended. Nothing was really going on in terms of that. Churches faithfully gathered and worshiped God, but sacraments somewhat ceased because we couldn't figure out how to do them. And so in the Episcopal Church, kind of later in 2020, all of the bishops and powers that be in the church got together to talk about ways in which we could bring back the sacraments. And in the Episcopal Church, and really in all ordaining professions, there is what we call a clergy shortage. For every 500 retirements that happen every year, 100 people are ordained. So if you're good at math, that means there are 400 places of worship that need clergy every year that don't have them. And what happened in COVID is that clergy experienced an incredibly high level of burnout, and people left ministry for good. So you already have a net loss of 400 people and 400 churches who need clergy who can't get them, and then you have a wave of clergy leaving ministry. And the bishops got together, and what they realized was happening is we were hurtling towards a pastoral cliff. Because bodies at this point are quite literally stacking up, and there's no one to bury them. There is no one to stand alongside people and help them answer the horrific questions of why has God allowed this to happen? Where was God when my family member got sick and died alone in a hospital? Where was my family? Where was God when my family had to grieve multiple losses from someone who didn't even know that they had COVID? Where's God when I live with that grief? You have this huge pastoral crisis. And the clergy got together and they said that one of the ways that they could deal with this pastoral crisis is by ordaining the people who graduated from seminary in May of 2020. They've quite literally been trained to be in these situations, and there's no way for them to serve because they're not yet ordained. And so the priests and the clergy got together and they decided that ordinations would be one of the first sacraments to come back. So these people could be deployed into situations where they could effectively help people. And ordinations posed a problem in COVID because the way in which people are ordained is that there's the laying on of hands. And that goes all the way back to when Jesus laid his hands on Peter and said, "You are the rock on which I will build my church." And so if you wanted to, and you were really bored one day, you could trace back every ordination from the laying on of hands all the way back to that first moment where Jesus laid his hands on Peter. But the laying on of hands obviously means that you have to physically touch somebody, and that's pretty hard to maintain 6 feet of distance in that point. So they got together and they determined that that was an acceptable level of risk to resume ordinations. And clergy pushed back hard. Clergy got together with their bishops all across the United States. And they effectively said, you cannot bring back ordinations before you bring back baptism. Baptism matters in this church. It matters to us as clergy, it matters to the laity. It is the vows in which we take, all of us take, and enter into this church. And it is the vows we take before God, and it is the vows that the church takes back to people when we say we will support you in your life. You can't bring back ordinations before you bring back baptisms. But the decision had already been somewhat made. Baptisms weren't happening at that point, but ordinations had restarted. But enough clergy got together with their bishops and pushed back, and enough bishops got together with other bishops that eventually, shortly after ordinations were brought back, baptisms were brought back. And baptisms were one of the earlier sacraments that were brought back into church. And you can research articles if you want where you can see priests who are effectively trying to baptize people by maintaining 6 feet of distance. There's this somewhat comical and great picture of a Catholic priest squirting a baby with a water gun. And it literally happened. Whether or not that baptism is valid, that's for the Catholic Church to decide. But it does show that clergy were desperately trying to fulfill a need in early COVID and trying to figure out ways in which our sacraments can be reimagined. What is the basic things that we need in baptism to make it a sacrament? We need water, we need people who will take vows, we need a community of believers who will vow to support that person. Baptism has always been an incredible joy in the church. It's the way in which people are welcomed in. There are 2 purposes for baptism in the Episcopal Church. The first is for the forgiveness of sins. But as you all know, we baptize babies, and babies are incapable of sin. They cannot sin. It's physically impossible for little infants who are 1 day old to be sinful. They can't choose between God and the devil. They can't choose to separate themselves from God. So we baptize them for all of the sins that they will commit in their life. But we also welcome them into a community of people that will support them wherever they go. And we do that by taking the vows in our baptismal rite. When we ask the people, will you who witness these vows do all in your power to support this person in their life and ministry? And sometimes that baby comes to church for one Sunday and then you never see them again. But the vows that we take are on behalf of every Christian church. And the vows that they take at every baptism that they ever perform in their church are on behalf of every church. So essentially, that little baby, or any person who is baptized, has been vowed by every single church that wherever they go, whenever they end up in a church, they will be loved and supported. Jesus began his formal ministry by coming alongside people to be baptized like they were baptized. Because the first and foremost thing that happens in this church is a God who begins ministry by coming alongside us. Amen.